Hello everybody, it's Mr. Pagachnik again, and this will be the final video that you will watch this year. And what I'm going to be going over is the race to space. So this is from going to the moon, basically. And this is going to be focusing on the race between the United States and the Soviet Union that took place during the Cold War and really sped up development with NASA and space in general. In 1962, President Kennedy promised that by the end of the decade, the United States was going to make it to the moon. It was a huge and lofty goal at the time because at that point they were just barely getting into space itself. So this was a huge and ambitious goal, and a lot of money and resources were going to be poured into this. So here's a bit of a timeline of events that actually get us to the moon. So World War II ended in 1945, and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, occupied Eastern Europe. We had the atomic bomb at the end of World War II. The United States was, of course, the ones who developed it, and the Soviet Union wound up getting the secrets as well. And this began this Cold War. Now, German scientists were kind of divided between the two sides. The United States got their hands on some of them and brought them over, and they were really working on rocketry because the Germans during World War II had a very advanced rocketry program. So during the Cold War, war breaks out in Korea in 1950. So for 3 years, there was this war, and it increased tensions. Following the ceasefire, the arms race accelerated, and they started to look at space as the new frontier. So both the United States and the Soviet Union started to eyeball space. So fueled by tensions in the escalating Cold War, science began their work on trying to dominate that next frontier and trying to get to space. All right, so 1957, the space race really gets going because the Soviets have now launched Sputnik 1 on an R-7 rocket. On the right, you'll see Sputnik 1. It was actually quite small, but it was the first man-made satellite to go up and actually go into orbit, and it's Russian for fellow traveler. The whole size of it was only 22 inches in diameter, so it was less than 2 feet across, and it was approximately 138 pounds, so the weight of an average high school kid. It orbited once every hour and 36 minutes, so it was moving quite quickly around the planet, traveling at 18,000 miles an hour, and it orbited for about a year. In 1957, the Soviets also sent a dog, Laika, to space. Laika did not return alive. Now, 1958 to 1959, America enters the space race, and the Soviets actually get to the moon. So in 1958, we launched Explorer 1. That's pictured on the right-hand side. That's all the bigger it was. It was considered the first scientific instrument because not only did it go up to go into orbit, but it actually was trying to read radiation in space. And it sent back enough information that they discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, which is something that they were going to have to deal with when they decided to travel out into space. NASA was created, and in 1959, the United States got the first picture of the Earth from orbit. Now, during this time, the Soviets got the first pic of the backside of the moon. So they made it all the way to the moon and took pictures of the backside of it. That was huge because nobody had sent anything that far. So they sent their first pics back that were actually converted to radio signals so that they could be sent back without having to actually get the pictures back. That was a pretty big technological advance. So now, 1960 to 61, things are starting to accelerate. In 1960, the Americans take the first spy photographs from space. The Soviets actually flew 2 dogs into space that returned alive, Belka and Strelka. In 1961, the Americans send Ham, the chimp, the first hominid, to space, and he actually lived until 1983. Not in space. He came back right away. On April 12th, in 1961, the Soviets sent the first human to space. So they have won that first leg of the space race. They sent Yuri Gagarin up to space on Vostok 1. On May 5th, the Americans sent Alan Shepard, so it was a difference of only several weeks. Now, also in 1961, the Soviets sent the first full-day manned mission. What you have to realize is these first 2 guys who went up just went up and came back down. They called it a popcorn shot. Gagarin and Shepard went up, got into space, turned around, came back down. By the end of 1961, the Soviets had somebody who was actually out there for an entire day. So now, 62 to 65, the Americans have a bunch of stuff going on. In 62, they had the first successful flyby of Venus. By successful, it means that they were actually able to send information back. They had the first reusable craft and space plane in 1963. First geosynchronous and geostationary satellites in 63 and 64, which are satellites that will maintain the same position above the Earth so that you can use them to send information all day, any day. They don't orbit. They orbit at the same speed that the Earth rotates. Project Gemini begins in 1965, and the United States had the first successful Mars flyby in 65. The Soviets had the first two-man spacecraft in 62, the first radio-to-radio space contact. They were the first to have two craft in space at the same time. The first woman and civilian in space in 63. The first unsuccessful Mars flyby in 1963. And the first spacewalk in 65. So they were winning a lot of the big things. They got the first woman in space. They had the first spacewalk. So here's a picture of a spacewalk from Gemini 4, which was ours. It wasn't the first, but it was one of them. And then on the right, you have Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova, the first woman in space for the Russians. Now, 66 to January of 69. The Americans have the first spacecraft docking. The first direct ascent rendezvous, which means they sent something directly up to space without putting it into orbit first, and it rendezvoused immediately. They had a tragedy of Apollo 1 burning up during a test on the pad, and the 3 astronauts were killed. This was not supposed to happen. They weren't even taking off. They were just doing communications tests. They had the first manned orbit of the moon in 1968 on Apollo 8, where they flew around and they went in orbit, but they never landed. And they also had the first humans to be in the gravity of a celestial body. That was also Apollo 8. They were actually in the gravitational field of the moon. The Soviets analyzed the atmosphere of Venus. They had the first docking of 2 remote-controlled spacecraft. They also had a tragedy in 62 when a Russian cosmonaut was killed when his parachutes failed on reentry, and that did not go well. He came down to the Earth full speed and crashed. The Soviets also had the first life forms to circle the moon, and the first parachute deployed on another celestial body when they landed on Venus in 1969. So on the left, you see the pictures of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Those were the 3 who tragically died on Apollo 1. And on the right, you have Vladimir Komarov, the Soviet cosmonaut who was killed on reentry. And it all happened in 1967. Now, July 16th, 1969 to July 24th, 1969. This is where Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin launched for the moon. They took off on top of what's called a Saturn V rocket, a massive rocket. The command and service module was called Columbia, and the lunar module was called Eagle. There'll be a picture of that in the next slide. About 3 hours after liftoff, they were repositioned. The lunar module was taken off the backside and put onto the front part of the command module, and they headed to the moon. Here's what it looked like. So here you can see the service module where the astronauts kind of live. Here's the command module. That's the capsule that's going to return. And this is the lunar module, known as Eagle. That's the part that actually lands on the moon. So July 20th, 1969, the Eagle undocked for the command module, and Armstrong piloted it to the ground. They were only 4 miles off from the predicted point that they thought they were going to land at. So at 109 hours, this is from takeoff to when they landed on the moon, it took 109 hours and 42 minutes. Neil Armstrong became the first person to step on the moon. Buzz Aldrin followed him 20 minutes later, and while they were on the moon, they spoke to President Nixon. Kind of cool. They spent about 21 and a half hours on the moon. That's it, not even a full day. And only 2.5 hours actually on the surface outside of the lander. So that means that while they were physically on the moon for 2.5 hours, they were only outside of the lander and stepping foot on the moon in their spacesuits for 2.5 hours. The lander fired off the moon on January 21st, and re-entry to the Earth happened on January 24th, 1969. The command module capsule touched down just 13 miles away from the rescue ship, so they were very accurate both where they landed on the moon and when they landed back on the planet. The Americans had won the race to the moon. And here are various pictures. Here's the lander as it's landing. Here's Armstrong stepping foot on the moon. Here's the flag that was positioned. Here's the first footprints. Here they are from left to right. Armstrong, Collins, who never stepped foot on the moon, and Alderaan, and here they are after they landed.